I went out that night and woke up in the morning and my siblings had disappeared. They were gone from the family home, and it turned out they had literally disappeared in the night, and my parents wouldn't tell me where they'd gone. Hadn't been any chance to say goodbye. It had been decided that I was clearly a wicked influence, and the safest thing for my brothers and sisters was to remove them from the family home.
Greg HOYLE, thanks so much for coming on to talk beliefs all the way from Auckland, New Zealand. You are the Chief News Director of the Sunday Star Times in Auckland. You've also worked on current affairs shows such as 60 Minutes New Zealand. In 2009, 60 Minutes focused on you as a seventh-generation member of the secretive Exclusive Brethren sect, as well as someone who had been expelled from the group after coming out as gay. Well, your book, Excommunicated, is out now in Australia and New Zealand from HarperCollins. It must be pretty exciting for you, Craig, to finally be able to bring the entire story to the world.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's a pretty surreal feeling. This has been a project that's been a couple of years in the making. HarperCollins approached me about writing a book, and it was a project that I was hesitant about taking on, but now that it's out there, I think it's I hope it stands as a record, not just of my story, but also the story of my family over 200 years with the Exclusive Brethren, and also the wider story of who the Brethren are.
Before we get into your story, can you give our audience an idea of who the Exclusive Brethren are, how they began, and what they believe?
Sure. So the Exclusive Brethren are an isolationist Christian sect, and probably the most defining feature is what they call their doctrine of separation, which bans all social contact with the outside world. So these days, you're born into the church, you go to a church school, you go to church every day of the week, 4 times on Sunday. When you leave school, you work for a church business, and then you marry someone from the church, and the whole cycle starts again. This was a group that began in the 1820s, part of a movement at that time to break away from the organised church, the Anglican church in particular. People didn't believe the trappings of organised religion were the right thing, and so it started out as a group of people who believed that they should follow the Bible and nothing else, which was possibly an admirable intention, but what it has become is something very different. And over the course of 200 years, the Exclusive Brethren have morphed into a group that is very tightly controlled by one leader who is referred to as the man of God or the elect vessel. We hear now that they call the current leader the CEO sometimes, and they have no social contact with outsiders. So that means no eating or drinking with outsiders, no friendships with outsiders. You can't go to things like movies, you can't go to sports games, you can't watch TV, you can't listen to the radio. If you leave the Brethren, you are immediately shunned from the group. For instance, after I came out of the Brethren, I haven't been welcome back in my parents' home, and that was 14 years.
Okay, let's go right back to the beginning and get a picture of your early days within the Exclusive Brethren. Craig, can you tell us what childhood was like for you growing up in the church, especially as someone from such a long lineage of Brethren members?
Yeah, look, my early childhood memories are actually very happy. We were surrounded by family and friends. There were always people around. We had my grandma living up the road and cousins living across the street, and wherever we went, we were surrounded by this enormous network of people who loved us and cared about us, and everything we wanted in our lives was there for us. Kind of like in this warm church embrace, I suppose. And my impressions as a very young child were that we didn't want for anything, and that there was always someone there to help or to comfort, and certainly nothing like loneliness or feeling that there was no support. And I didn't really realize that we were different until I was 5, which was when I started school. And at that point, the brethren still went into state schooling for at least the first part of their education. And I turned up in school at the age of 5, and suddenly I'd always known that there were these other people out there that we called worldlies, and they didn't go to the same church as us. They didn't believe in the same things. But because my life was full of people who were from the brethren, to me, the brethren were the normal people, and the outsiders, the worldlies, they were the ones that were strange. And then when I started at primary school at the age of 5, there was me and there was one other brethren girl in the class, and suddenly I was the strange one. I was the one who wasn't allowed to eat morning tea or lunch with the kids. In fact, I had to go home for lunch because it wasn't suitable for us to eat where there were worldlies, and wasn't allowed to watch videos in the classroom, wasn't allowed to go on some school field trips. And there was a very distinct feeling, even at a very young age, that I was different, that I was marked, that I was seen as strange by the outside world. And of course, the flip side to that is you feel strange in the outside world, and you feel that people know you're different. And then, of course, when you return to the church community and you're going to church meetings and so on, you're suddenly back with your people, and you're back where everybody understands who you are, understands where you're coming from. And so that early experience of encountering the world outside of the church reinforced for a young child how special the church community was, or at least that was how it was portrayed to us at the time. And probably around the same time was when I first started realizing that there were people who had left the church. It was unthinkable to me as a very young child that anyone would leave this community because we had everything we needed. And I knew that, for instance, my grandma lived. I knew that some people had grandmas and grandpas, and I knew that I only had a grandma. But I was too young to know what that meant, and it never occurred to me in those very early years to say, hey, why don't I have a grandpa? But there were these warning or these early indicators that some things weren't quite right with our family. And I remember when I was a young child, if I was naughty or strong-willed, people would say, and it would be said quietly. I wasn't supposed to hear, but people would say, "Oh, isn't he just like George?" And I didn't know who George was, and it was quite some time before I realised that this George that I was being compared to was my grandfather, who had been excommunicated from the church years before I was born. But I did learn very quickly that being compared to George was not a good thing. And that was really the first awareness for me, I suppose, that it was possible to leave this brethren community, and that not only was it possible to leave, but it was possible for the church community to throw you out. And by the time I was 7 or 8, there was a very clear understanding that certain transgressions would be punished by excommunication, and there were grades of sins, and you very quickly learned which sins would get you in trouble with your parents, and which sins would involve the priests, and which sins would get you shut up, which is the first stage of excommunication, like being put in quarantine, I suppose. And then there were some sins that the brethren considered so bad that they would skip straight to withdrawing from you, which is a final stage of excommunication where you're no longer considered a member at all. And so understanding how these rules worked, and the rules changed all the time. They weren't written down. The rules from one year to the next, from one leader to the next, weren't always the same. And so you're dealing with this constantly shifting understanding of what it meant to be brethren and what it meant to follow these rules, even when you weren't supposed to be questioning them. there did have to be an element of trying to interpret how and what and why the rules were to be followed. And we ended up living in Invercargill, which was in the 90s. The Brethren embarked on a redistribution of members around the world and also within New Zealand. So the Brethren congregations have got quite large in cities like Auckland and Hamilton and Wellington and so on. And they started, or in some cases restarted, assemblies in smaller places, sort of the outskirts of New Zealand. And we ended up in Invercargill, which is a city right at the bottom of the South Island. So when I was 5, we moved from Hamilton in the North Island to Invercargill in the South Island, and started again really with a new Brethren assembly. And that was quite a culture shock as well, because Brethren assemblies, often it was the same families who had been in the same places for generations. And so there were these deep alliances and understandings of who and what different families were. And in Invercargill, it was Brethren families from all across New Zealand thrown together into a sort of a hodgepodge where we didn't have these long-standing connections. And that was quite an interesting, looking back, interesting experience. A blessing and a mixed blessing. And there was very much a sense that some of the people who had come to Invercargill were trying to get away from the baggage that they'd had in their previous Brethren assemblies. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that baggage has a way of following people. But I was 5 at the time, and I had no concept that that it was probably quite a good thing for my family to have left Hamilton. That there were all these ghosts in Hamilton of family members that had been excommunicated, and all these terrible memories associated with the houses that we'd been living in and so on. To me, it was just an adventure. And looking back, I think probably for certainly my dad and my grandma, it was an escape from some of the dreadful things that had happened. And this wasn't just my grandpa, and both my grandfathers had been excommunicated from the Brethren. So both my parents had lost their fathers as teenagers, and then my dad had also had a brother and a sister excommunicated, and 3 uncles and aunts excommunicated. My mum had had 2 uncles excommunicated, and then several of my great-grandparents had been excommunicated. And so there were generations of loss and grief that the family was dealing with. And Invercargill was a fresh start, but our family continued to have challenges, I would say, with life in the Brethren and with life more generally. In some ways, it was a good childhood. In other ways, it was a very difficult childhood. There was a lot of violence when I was growing up, and that was that's not good in any family situation, but it's particularly bad in a church situation where the father is seen as the head of the household, where all other members of the family are supposed to submit to his authority, and it puts the child. No, is not a perfect child by any means, but I really remember the sense of unfairness when my dad would be violent, and then I got big enough to fight back. And then when I did fight back, he would call the priests around, and I would get in trouble for being a rebellious child. And it's like, well, what about the fact that he was trying to beat me up in the first place? And that was not a question that the priests ever asked. No one ever said, well, what's going on in the family home? Why are you acting like this? Why is, and I was still a very young child at that point, why is a young child believing that violence isn't okay? way to resolve some of these things? Like, where have these patterns of behavior been learnt? And there's a really strong sense of injustice on my part, that anything that ever happened was always put back on me as a child because I was not submitting to my father's authority. And that was a really damaging environment. And also, as the oldest child in the family, I ended up bearing the brunt of a lot of what was going on. And so through my teenage years, there was a lot more focus on what was going on with our family than what was going on with me. So when I was 16, my dad, my mum was in hospital. She had surgery that went wrong and she almost died. And my dad had a mental breakdown around that time. And so both our parents were incapacitated in different ways. And the brethren, there was very little recognition or support for the situation that our family was in. And I remember talking to the brethren elders, and they told me that I needed to step in and take responsibility for the family, and that both my parents had lost their fathers. And so it was my responsibility to be a father figure to my parents and to take responsibility for my 6 younger siblings, and also to take responsibility for the family business. And this was all going on in the context of, so I had left the state education system at the end of year 8 and had done a couple of years of homeschooling, which was how the brethren were doing high school at the time. And then when I was year 11, they started their own schools proper. So for the last 2 years of my education, I was at a brethren school. The teachers were not brethren, which put them in a very difficult position because they were trying to teach a brethren curriculum, or at least a curriculum that was acceptable to the brethren, and recognizing that a lot of us students had questions and that we were challenging the church teachings with which the teachers didn't necessarily agree, but they were obliged to hold the line and stop us from breaking them. And a very real tension for some of those teachers, I think. And looking back, we really pushed the boundaries sometimes. We knew that these teachers weren't brethren, and that made them somehow lesser than us. And so it was difficult for the teachers to fully be respected or to be able to maintain authority over us. There's the sense of them and us when you're in a group like the brethren. The brethren are the people who have the true light, and everybody else is unwashed or unsaved or blinded or ignorant, or and that's a very, very dismissive attitude to take when you're in a classroom environment and you and the other students are brethren, and the teacher is a world leader, someone who's lesser, who yes, you're supposed to respect, but doesn't deserve the same level of respect as someone from the brethren community. And so this was all going on, a very, very complicated mess through my life at that point, going through the brethren education system, both of my parents unwell. I left school at the age of 16 and went into the family business. And so for me, it really felt at that point as though things were building to a head and I wasn't being supported by the church.
Everything changed when, at age 16, you realized you were gay. Not exactly something you want to shout from the rooftops when you're a member of this particular sect. Isn't that right?
Yes, it's an understatement. There was a growing feeling as a teenager while all these things were going on. I knew that something wasn't right. And I'd always known that I was different from when I was a young child, and the first awareness for me would have been when we went through puberty and all the other boys started talking about girls, and I couldn't work out what this was about. It wasn't something that interested me, and it took a few more years after that for me to realize that there was this thing called being gay, and that not all boys did like girls. And ironically, my first awareness of that was when the civil union bill was going through Parliament here in New Zealand, and the Brethren campaigned very, very strongly against the civil union bill, holding prayer meetings and lobbying politicians and so on. And ironically, the Brethren campaigning against the civil union bill was what led to my first awareness that the gay community existed, and that there were words that described people like me and gave me my first framework for understanding how and why I might be different. And I didn't want to be different. I was terrified. There's no acceptance in the Brethren for anything that deviates from what they regard as the acceptable norm. And so for a while, it was something that I just pushed down to one side. I refused to think about it. It was too terrible to contemplate, really. And so I didn't think about it, or tried not to think about it. And there were all of these other things going on in my life anyway. I was more concerned with getting through school or figuring out a new job or supporting my family, all of these things that seemed much more important than what at that point was an academic question about whether I was into boys or girls. The Brethren didn't allow sex before marriage, so it wasn't like it was something that I could explore. And it came to a head finally when I was 18. And at that point, our family situation had settled down, and I was in a place where I was beginning to question who I was and my place in the Brethren. And the Brethren were very big on confessions. They believed that if you were to get right with God, if you were to achieve true spiritual enlightenment, you needed to get right with God and get right with the Brethren. And what this led to around the age of 17, 18 was me studiously confessing all of my sins. And this would go on for months and months and months, and I'd dredge back through trying to think of every single bad thing I'd done and confessing it to the priests. And then if I'd said something unkind to someone, I would go and apologize to them for it. And what I avoided saying was that I was gay. And to me, that was too terrible a thing to bring up with the priests. And so I spent months confessing all my sins and working through them one by one, late night sessions with one of the priests, almost always involving alcohol. And I didn't feel any different. Like, the idea was that you confessed your sins and the burden of sin lifted off your shoulders and you reached some new level of enlightenment. And I was very distressed when that didn't happen, and realized or decided that the reason the burden of sin wasn't lifting is that I hadn't confessed the biggest sin of all, which was being gay. And so eventually I did confess that I was gay, and it was a confession because I believed that being gay was a sin. And I believed at that point that the Brethren had the power to help change my sexuality. And that was what they tried to do. And so after I came out as gay to one of the local priests in Invercargill, they worked through this for several months, praying with me and, suggesting that maybe I needed to cast out demons and all of these sorts of things. And it came to a head in 2008. It would have been at the beginning of the end of 2007, December 2007, when the world leader of the Brethren, Bruce Hales, came to Invercargill for special church meetings, and the local priests organised for me to have an audience with Bruce Hales, which was a tremendous privilege. If you get access to the world leader, it's as though you're speaking to God, and I genuinely believed that Bruce Hales had the power to wave his hands and cure me of being gay. And I met him, and that didn't happen. And instead, he told me to never accept myself for who I was, and to always fight my sexuality, essentially. And he also told me that there's medication you can go on for these things. And one thing led to another. I met, the following day, or a day or two later, I met one of his relatives who was doctor in the church, Dr. Roger Kirkpatrick, and had a very, very invasive session with him. He appeared to have been drinking. Everyone was drinking. And got into a line of questioning that didn't really have anything to do with treating me in a medical sense. It was all about what I had done and who I had done it with and where and when and how many times, and did I prefer a penis soft or hard, and did I prefer penetrating or being penetrated, and right down to was I sexually attracted to Peter Hickmott, who was one of the local priests in Invercargill. And I came away from that encounter feeling dirty and ashamed, and feelings that I believed were down to my sin. I was gay. This was bad. It was one of the ultimate sins. And so, of course, I felt dirty and ashamed. And it took a long time for me to realize that I came out of that encounter feeling the way I did because of how prurient and inappropriate it had been, and that it was not my fault that I had come out of it feeling like dirt, really. And it was too much to this whole concept of spending the rest of my life fighting who I was, never accepting myself, was too much. And a few days later, I tried to run away for the first time. Ultimately, a failed attempt. The Brethren found me and pulled me back in. And following that, I was sent to live in Sydney, which is where Bruce Hales is from. And this was quite a detailed level of oversight. If you were young and troubled in the Brethren, then you were sent to live in other cities, and they called them encouragement trips. The idea was to show you what a good life you could have in the Brethren, and why would you turn your back on this? This is the wonderful fellowship. See how much we love you. And being sent to Sydney was the greatest encouragement trip of all, because that was where Bruce Hales lived. So there I was in Sydney, and I had several encounters with Bruce Hales while I was there, including going out for dinner with him and having a chat with him in his office. And following seeing Bruce Hales again, I was sent to see another Brethren doctor, Dr. Mark Craddock, who lived in Sydney, again with a view to receiving treatment for my sexuality. And Dr. Mark Craddock told me that he had been experimenting with various drugs on other young people to see if he could successfully change their sexuality, and that he hadn't had any luck with that as yet. But what he could do in the meantime was prescribe me a hormonal suppressant that would stop me from having sexual urges. And there wasn't any discussion about what this drug was really, or whether this was an appropriate way to be prescribing it, what the side effects might be, how long I should be taking it. And he prescribed Ciprostat, which is a hormonal suppressant that cuts off the supply of testosterone to the body, normally reserved for people with prostate cancer or for sex offenders. And what it does is completely shuts down any sexual urges that you might have, and the side effects include all sorts of things, including depression and anxiety and so on. And he gave me enough repeats to keep taking the drug for at least a year without seeing another doctor. And I took the drug for a few weeks, and again felt terrible, all sorts of, lethargic and depressed and so on. And after a few weeks, I stopped taking it, and I wrote to Bruce Hales and thanked him very much for his support, and I thought it had all worked and I was okay now, and I was ready to go back to New Zealand, and I think I was cured, and well done everyone, which of course wasn't true. But I suppose at that point there was a feeling that I needed to get away from Sydney, and there was no point in flogging a dead horse that clearly wasn't working. And once I was back in New Zealand, we're very much cutting a long story short here. But the last time I saw Bruce Hales was in Brisbane. We were up there for special church meetings, and I talked to him again before flying back to New Zealand. And again, he told me not to accept myself and for who I was, and again, that there would be no future for me if I went out into the world, and that being gay was an empty lifestyle. Basically, that I'd never find happiness if I left the Brethren, and that this was the place for me, and how wonderful to see you back on the right track and going back to your family and the fellowship and so on. And back in New Zealand, I later that year was really the beginning of the end for me. I realized that there was no future for me in the Brethren, and that I wasn't ever going to be able to live a good life if I stayed in the church. And part of that for me was a growing awareness of other people who had been in the same situation as me, who had been gay. And one of my options was to try and suppress who I was and marry a woman and have a family and just pretend that everything was okay. And I had seen or became aware of other people in the Brethren who had gone down this track. And what had happened with a number of them is that they had managed to sort of successfully suppress who they were until they got to their 30s or their 40s, at which point they had a midlife crisis, or maybe you're not quite midlife at that point, but they certainly had a crisis, and everything fell apart for them. They ended up leaving the church anyway, coming out as gay anyway. And I was very clear as a teenager, 18 and 19, that I didn't want to go down that path. I didn't want to leave the Brethren. I didn't want to leave my family. I didn't want to lose my friends or my job or my home or anything like that. But I could see that the longer I left it, the more collateral damage there would be. And to me, if I accepted that there wasn't a life for me in the church, then the most responsible thing to do was to cut the ties as quickly as possible, because I could see if I left it another 15, 20 years, firstly, I would have wasted a large portion of my life, and secondly, there would likely be a wife and children and a house and all of these other people and things that would suffer as a result. And so there was this very there was no light bulb moment exactly, but this dawning realization that I needed to get out.
The efforts to change your sexuality didn't work, and that meant only one thing: excommunication. So talk about that.
As I said, a growing realization around the age of 18, 19, that there was no future for me in the Brethren. And so over the course of 6 months, I started laying the groundwork for a new life, tentatively putting out feelers, which was difficult at that time. Didn't have proper internet access, didn't have any friends outside the church. I remember trying to find other gay people, and I'd seen a listing in the local newspaper for a gay support group, and basically just a couple of lines and a phone number. And so I knew that there was a support group in Invercargill, and I waited months for that listing to appear in the paper again. But over the course of 6 months or so, started to build some of those connections and talk to people outside the church, all very discreetly, of course, and also starting to shift some of my brethren connections off to the side. And so there was certainly toward the end a feeling that I was saying my farewells, seeing people for the last time. And I went on a road trip at the beginning of 2009, up and down the country, seeing different people. And really, for me, it was a farewell tour, but no one I met knew that. Things came to a head when I came out as gay to my brothers and sisters. It reached a point where I was determined to no longer hide who I was, and I came home from work one day and came out as gay to my siblings, and it was a very difficult afternoon. There were some siblings who didn't understand. My youngest sister didn't know what being gay meant, and when she started asking, my mother sort of cut across and said, well, he doesn't love you, that's what it means if he's saying something like that, which of course wasn't true. I love my sister very much. And I went out that night and woke up in the morning, and my siblings had disappeared. They were gone from the family home, and it turned out they had literally disappeared in the night, and my parents wouldn't tell me where they'd gone. Hadn't been any chance to say goodbye. It had been decided that I was clearly a wicked influence, and that the safest thing for my brothers and sisters was to remove them from the family home. And the priests wanted to see me. My parents said that they had requested a meeting immediately, which I refused because I knew that it would mean being placed in the first stage of excommunication. And so I spent that day driving around Invercargill saying goodbye to everyone that I cared about, my grandma and my uncle and auntie and friends and cousins and so on. And that is what I would say was the worst day of my life. Just an absolute shattering of everything that I cared about, and saying goodbye to these people and knowing that I would probably never see them again. And I'll never forget the way, my grandma just stood on her front doorstep, and she wouldn't let me into her house because she had heard what was happening, and she no longer believed that it was suitable for me to be in her home. But she stood on her front doorstep just sobbing and talking about how could the devil be so cruel. And this was a dreadful, dreadful situation for her. You know, she had seen her grandfather excommunicated when she was younger, and then her parents had been excommunicated in the 70s, and then her husband had been excommunicated, then two of her children, and now here was I, the first of her grandchildren, fifth generation that she'd lost. And she just kept saying over and over, how could the devil be so cruel? And of course, we know this had nothing to do with the devil. This wasn't the devil's doing. This was entirely down to the Brethren doctrine of separation. But from her perspective, there was no blaming the Brethren. You know, she'd long ago made her choice about where her loyalties lay, and the church was more important than family. And that evening, I did finally meet the priests. I said I was going to be placed in the first stage of excommunication. And after that, once I had been shut up, as they call it, I was shunned by the rest of the church. So I was still in the same house as my parents, but they refused to eat or drink with me. And if I was walking down the road and brethren walked toward me the other way, they wouldn't stop and talk. And so at that point, it was much easier to move on and start building a new life, because there wasn't the same pressure from within the church. The priest was still trying to talk to me regularly. I refused, and my response to them was very much, I have left your church, leave me alone. But one thing that I was very, very clear about is that I had left the church voluntarily, but I was not choosing to leave my family or my friends or my home or my job. And that was really important to me, because I had seen so many times someone would leave the brethren, then the brethren would make it very uncomfortable for them in the family home, to the point where they moved out. And the brethren would then turn around and say, oh, look, you moved out, you abandoned us. We didn't kick you out, you chose to leave. And I was very clear that I didn't want the brethren to be able to say that about me. And so I just stayed put. And my parents clearly wanted me gone, and said as much in person. And I kept saying to them, if you want me gone, you know, I'm happy to leave at any time, but I want you to put in writing why you want me gone. And of course, they never would. And it led to the inevitable conclusion. They did throw me out. They waited until I was in Australia on holiday, and the day before I came back to New Zealand, my dad called me and said I was no longer welcome in their home, and that all of my belongings had been moved into a storage unit, and to contact him for the key. And that was it. Never been welcome back in their house since. Yeah, it was really important for me to follow that path to its bitter end, to prove that this was not my choice. And that was in August 2009. And then there was a very messy process for a month or two of extracting myself from the family business, because my employment came to an end. And the final blow came on 31st of October 2009. It was Halloween. And one of the priests called me, it was a Saturday morning, to say that it was a very long-winded explanation, but essentially I had been withdrawn from, I had been put through the final stage of excommunication. I was no longer a member of the community. They'd washed their hands of me and accepted that I was no longer a member of their church.
So, what was it like for someone who had lived apart from the world to suddenly be part of the world?
Not at all what I'd expected. Growing up in the Brethren, we were always told that the world was a cold, hard, cruel place, and that the Brethren were the only place we would find love and support and acceptance. And when I left the Brethren, I found the opposite to be true. The people who had always said they loved and supported me were nowhere to be seen, and in their place were complete strangers who didn't know me at all, who were stepping in to support me and replace the family and friends that I'd lost. And so after my parents threw me out, I lived with a gay couple in Invercargill for a while, two women, and they were responsible really for showing me um, those very early steps of what it meant to be in regular society. And I think the thing that always strikes me is that you talk about these big things. You've lost your family, you've lost your job, and those are all terrible things and they're overwhelming. But the little things are equally overwhelming. But I had never watched TV before. I didn't know how to use a TV remote. I didn't know how to tune a radio dial. I didn't know how to eat at a restaurant. I didn't know how to go to a bar. All of these things that everyone else took for granted as part of their daily functioning were things I didn't know about. And in the immediate context of that day to day, those small things can be just as tough as the big things you're dealing with. And so I was still living in Invercargill at this point, and there was a lot of support from the outside world. People generally were horrified by what had happened to me, and believed that the way I had been treated was awful. And there was this really strong coming together of the local community, people who could see that I had suffered this terrible loss and who were there to step in and support me and show me that love and compassion that was so clearly lacking from my past. And going alongside this was a journey to reconnect with family. And I knew that I had my grandpa in the outside world, for instance, and uncles and aunties and cousins and so on. And so trying to find these people, people that I vaguely knew existed, but hadn't met or had no concept of really, or that we'd always been told were evil or wicked or opposed to the fellowship. And so it was quite a psychological step for me to say, reach out to someone like my grandpa, because all my life I'd been hearing of it, what a bad person he was. And when I finally met grandpa and I looked him up in the phone book and called him, and to my surprise, he was nothing at all like what I had been told he was. He was warm and kind and supportive. And the first time I met him, I remember it vividly. The first time we had a meal together, we met at the McDonald's downtown Wellington, and it was like looking into a mirror, and someone with the same facial expressions and the same mannerisms, and he sort of found the same things funny, and it was just utterly strange. This was the first time in 19, 20 years that I had met this man, and yet it felt like we had this immediate family connection. It was so clear that we were family. And the thing that stuck with both of us, so when I eat at McDonald's, I always gather all the rubbish together at the end and cram it into the cup to reduce the size of the rubbish down as much as possible. always done this, and and I was sitting there at McDonald's and cramming all the rubbish into the cup, and then I looked across the table, and there was my grandpa doing exactly the same thing. Um, and yes, and we looked at each other and just, we laughed. Um, and the peculiar thing with meeting these family members on the outside world is, I realized that there was this quite comprehensive network of family outside the brethren. Um, it was kind of like my family had been split in two, and there was the brethren side and there was the non-brethren side. Um, and I was having to piece the two together and remember who fitted where. So there was this whole network of uncles and aunties and cousins and my grandpa and so on, that was part of the same family network but had nothing to do with the other side, not by choice, but that was the way the brethren had it. And that was quite a revelation to me, that there was all this love and support outside of the brethren. So a few weeks after I was withdrawn from, I was contacted by a reporter from 60 Minutes, which was screening on TV3 at that point in New Zealand, and she asked if I would tell my story, and one thing led to another, and it was quite unusual for someone to speak out publicly so soon after leaving the brethren. But in my case, I felt very strongly that what had happened to me was unjust, and that the brethren deserved scrutiny for the way I'd been treated. And that was, for me, a massive turning point in my life. The reporter and producer for 60 Minutes were very supportive of who I was, and they wanted to know what I was passionate about and what my plans were. And I had no idea. I was fresh out of a cult, and did I want to go to university? I didn't know. Did I want to do this kind of a job or that kind of job? I didn't know. Did I want to go traveling? Like, well, maybe. And they very strongly encouraged me to consider becoming a journalist. And they took me into TV3 to meet the executive producer of 60 Minutes, and said that they would support me if I wanted to go down this track, and offered to back me into university if and when the time came, and told me to go off and travel the world and have some life experience for a year, and then come back and tell them how I felt, which is what I ended up doing. I spent most of 2010 traveling, going to different countries, having new experiences, and just broadening my horizons in ways that were inconceivable to someone who had come from the brethren, and came back to New Zealand at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, and went back to the team at 60 Minutes and said, you know what, I think I will be a journalist. So they wrote me a letter of recommendation, backed me into a degree, and gave me a job as a first-year student. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, after an arduous and emotional journey out of the Brethren's world, you are now Chief News Director for the Sunday Star Times, leading a team of reporters. You've also completed a book about your story growing up in the Brethren. So how would you describe the process of writing Excommunicated, and what do you hope people will get out of this memoir?
For me, this process of writing the book has, it's my story, but it's so much more than my story. And this came about partly because my grandfather died in 2019, and when we were going through his belongings, we realized that he had documented his entire life. So there were letters and diaries, and even notes of phone conversations that he thought were important. And there was this complete history of his life and how he had been excommunicated and how it had made him feel. And not only his records, but there were also his parents' diaries and his grandparents' letters and so on, and stretching all the way back. And so it was very clear to me that my experiences were not unique and that this was something that had been impacting our family for 200 years, really. And so in writing the book, I wanted to pull it together as an intergenerational memoir showing my story, also my family story, and also the brethren's story, and how those things interwove. As I said to HarperCollins when they first approached me about writing a book, telling one person's story in isolation doesn't capture the impact. The traumas that I've experienced were layered on top of the traumas my parents experienced and their parents and so on. And so I really hope that the book captures the multi-generational impact of that trauma and how each one of us is just the latest chapter or the latest development on what has been a very long journey, and that this is not a new thing. This has been going on for 200 years. And so I hope it'll speak to other people who have come from the Brethren or religious groups, but it's also, I think, a wider story about overcoming and being true to yourself. And so far, here in New Zealand and in Australia, it seems to be very well received. There has been a lot of positive feedback, and it will be released. So it's out in Australia and New Zealand now. It'll be out in the UK in March next year, and it will be out in North America around June, July. While the print version is not available everywhere in the world, the Kindle ebook version is available now everywhere.
It's an extraordinary story, Craig, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to come onto the show today. I will leave links to your book and social media in the description below, and hopefully we can have you back on Talk Beliefs in the very near future.
Thanks, Mark. It's been great to chat. Look forward to talking again.